So today we're going to be talking about how Australian councils can support a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. And I'd like to start off by acknowledging country. So I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining from Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country, and I want to acknowledge that everyone here on the call from around the world and around this continent, we're all joining from unceded Indigenous lands and here in Australia, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lands. And I'd like to thank and acknowledge the elders of all First Nations for looking after country since the Dreamtime, and pay respect to all Indigenous peoples here and around the world, including those present with us today. So just by way of a very quick introduction, just in case you haven't been to a CEA webinar before, my name's Sally McAdams. I coordinate Climate Emergency Australia, and we're a network of Australian councils that have declared a climate emergency. And with that, just a tiny bit of housekeeping before we introduce our speakers. So please do stay on mute. We have quite a few people on the call today, so that'll just help us to keep the background noise down if you can stay on mute. We are recording today, so if by chance you don't want to appear in a recording, you may want to turn your video off. If you have questions, please put them in the chat, just because we have quite a few people. That will make it a little easier to sort through. And if you'd like to connect with us, Climate Emergency Australia, the details are up there on the screen, and we'll share this with you later on as well. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our two speakers today. So we have Dr. Kumi Naidoo, who's the president of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. And as Rob mentioned earlier, Dr. Naidoo is joining from Costa Rica, so we'll just bear with any little technical delays that we have. And we'll have Rob Law, who's the Senior Manager of Energy Transitions for WWF Australia as well. But we're going to start with Dr. Naidoo. He's a human rights and climate justice activist from South Africa. He's currently the president of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, and he was previously the Executive Director of Greenpeace International and the Secretary General of Amnesty International and the Secretary General of Civicus. So he's got a very long history of activism. He was an activist in the apartheid regime, and he's written about these experiences in Letters to My Mother, The Making of a Troublemaker. So Kumi, I'll hand over to you, and I'm going to start sharing your slides. Just bear with me while I change over.
Thank you, Sally, and greetings, everyone. I hope technology is going to hold. Are you hearing me clearly so far?
Yep, that's great.
Okay, great. I just want to make sure that I got the maximum volume. So firstly, thank you for giving the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative a chance to be with you at this very important webinar for how Australian councils can support a fossil fuel phase out generally and specifically support a global fossil fuel treaty. I must confess that these days I'm significantly more nervous than the days when I was a 15-year-old activist against the apartheid regime. And this can be captured in the story quickly, that I was speaking to a group of US foundations, and at the end of it, somebody put up their hand and said, so Kumi, do you know what Martin Luther King's most famous speech was called? Thinking it was a trick question, I very gently said, I have a dream. And then she shouted back, she said, yes, it was I have a dream. When I hear you speak, you seem to have a bloody nightmare. The forests are disappearing, the oceans are rising, fascism is on the rise, and so on. In this anecdote lies one of the key challenges of leadership, whether you're in a civil society organization or you're in a local government or in a national government. How do we speak truth to power on the one hand and not sanitize the fact that humanity is in a deep, deep crisis? But how can we also do that in a way that energizes, motivates, inspires, rather than immobilize and create despair? So I want to start with a bit of a pop quiz next to bring you into the conversation. Where do you think humanity is in terms of rising to address the climate crisis? So the first option one, which you can put in the chat, is no reason to panic. Our national governments and business will get the act together and prevent the worst. These words are important. prevent the worst of catastrophic climate change. Because let's be clear, we are already in catastrophe already, from Australia to the US to Africa to Asia and so on. We are seeing lives being lost, infrastructure being damaged and so on. The question with option one is, yes, we acknowledge that, but we think we can prevent what scientists call irreversible runaway climate change, right? That's option one. Option two, you don't say everything is fine. You say, actually, we're in a deep crisis and the window of opportunity to turn things around is closing, but it is within human capability for us to broaden that window and move us away from the suicidal trajectory that humanity currently is on. And option three is, if I can be permitted to use a language from South Africa called Afrikaans to give you option three, but you won't need translation, hopefully. Option three is, ons is deep, deep, deep in the kak, okay? That it's too late. So I wonder whether people are able to just put 1, 2, 3, and Sally, if you can give me a sense of where the mood of the meeting is after I go through the next slide. So in this moment of history that we find ourselves in, pessimism is a luxury we simply cannot afford. The pessimism that justifiably emerges from our analysis, our lived experience, and our observations can, must, and should be responded to by the optimism of our thought, our action, our creativity, our courage, and our sense of humanity. So what in the current moment can give us reason to be optimistic? I'm going to bring you in, Sally, just to give me a sense of whether people have responded and just a sense of where
majority
we're talking about.
Saying B.
Yeah.
A few C's, mostly B.
And there are some C's, and nobody probably said A, right?
Not so far.
Okay. So if I'm brutally honest, there are days when I wake up where I am sort of 2, and there are other days I'm 2.5. I try not to get to 3. So let's look at why we have to move on the treaty and to phase out fossil fuels. 86% of the carbon that has been choking our atmosphere over the past decade comes from the extraction and burning of the world's 3 deadliest products, oil, coal, and gas. But what's extraordinary is that it took us 28 years of negotiations at the climate COP before we reached a point where the term fossil fuels was even mentioned in a COP outcome document, right? That's as absurd as Alcoholics Anonymous holding 28 years of conferences before they eventually have the courage to mention the word alcohol. And of course, the reason for that is that the largest delegations annually now, about 4,000, 5,000 is what we're hitting, is from the fossil fuel lobby industry, lobbyists from the fossil fuel industry. But let's just stop for a moment and look at how we've been trying to address the problem of fossil fuels, right? So, and I'm going to give you a simple image. Imagine you left home one morning and you left the tap running in the bath gently, and you put the stopper on, and by the time you get back home from work, the place is flooded in the your bathroom is flooded, and then the water now is moving into the passageway, and you notice it as you enter the home. And as you're passing the kitchen, you pick up a mop and you proceed towards the water. What do you do first? Do we start mopping the water, or do we turn off the tap? Right? Mopping the water is important. We have to do that. Like have renewables, all the interventions that we do that comes out of the car, all of that is important. But we cannot deny the reality that if we don't turn the tap on fossil fuels, we are kidding ourselves that we are addressing the future of our children and grandchildren. So if we can move to the next slide, why is the fossil fuel treaty gaining momentum that it has right now? I'm not seeing the screen, Sally, but I'm going to keep going, and hopefully you can get slide 6 and 7 up soon. So we are not pushing back and saying, oh, don't worry about the COP, the Paris Agreement is useless and so on, okay? We are saying what is needed here is a complementarity. We need to have something additional to the COP, which is more binding. Now, just to be clear, already in 2009 at the Copenhagen Climate Summit, the clarion call was, we want a fab deal, not a fabulous deal, but a fair, ambitious, and binding deal. And the word binding, already in 2009, climate justice campaigners knew that we had to get that, right? But what we've got year in, year out since 2009 is a FLAB deal, F-L-A-B, full of loopholes and BS, right? And so we would be foolish right now, and we would be ignoring what Albert Einstein said when he said a definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting to get different results, if we do not recognize that the non-binding nature of COP is inadequate, and therefore we need to have a complementary instrument, as we did with landmines, as we did with nuclear weapons, and so on. So just to give you a quick overview of the process and phases for the treaty, and I believe it's the next slide. Yeah, that one. So basically, there are multiple things that we are working on. So basically, we are, just to be clear, there's no existing fossil fuel treaty. We are pushing the idea of the treaty, and we've got different steps there. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of them. You can see it on your screen. And we now are at least in stage 3. And if I can go to the next slide, is who has already supported the call for the fossil fuel treaty. Just stay on the other treaties as models. So here's the important thing. Many of you, the next one, please. Yeah. Now, many of you will be saying, hey, these guys are not being serious. Given Trump's there and we've got so many conservative governments, how can we ever pull this off? Actually, we can, because we're following largely the roadmap that the landmine treaty followed, which was, it was negotiated outside of the UN system, 44 countries negotiated, and then it was brought within the system and got adopted. Now, some might say some of the big countries like China, US, Russia did not sign it, but there's no question it completely transformed their behavior with regard to the manufacture, distribution, and deployment of landmines. And we saw that it was only when Russia invaded Ukraine that we saw an increase in the use of landmines. But right until then, it was so even if, say, Trump doesn't sign it, it doesn't mean that it would not put constraints on their behavior. So who has supported the fossil fuel treaty? Next slide, please. So there's more than 4,000 civil society organizations, 10 indigenous nations, and 118 subnational governments, which basically includes states like ACT, Australian Capital Territory in Australia, or California in the US have endorsed. And we have, even the city of Newcastle, I hope there's some councillors from Newcastle on this call, which is a coal-dependent city, have also, endorsed this initiative. And we have a very high number of cities that we are working on globally, and we will be making a big announcement about a very high-profile mayor coming on board as an envoy to work with other councils. Especially Australia will be a target if what we anticipate will happen, which is that the COP will go to Australia and the Pacific next year, COP31. So the next slide, please. Pacific nations have been very clear. Solidarity means action, not rhetoric. The Australian government frequently talks about standing with the Pacific while continuing to approve new fossil fuel projects. The climate envoy from Vanuatu, who's now just become actually the climate minister, has said that Australia is not acting in good faith by claiming climate leadership while expending fossil fuels. Now, I just want to stop here and just give you a stat which you might have heard of in March. Today, Australia, when it reports to the UN on its NDCs, National Determined Contributions, can actually present a very good picture showing how they are reducing their emissions and so on within Australia. But the terrible, sad reality that we are dealing with is that today, Australia is either the second or third country, depending whether you talk about actual emissions or volume of exports. You got Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Australia is in the top 3 in terms of fossil fuel exports that we are seeing. So Pacific nations have already taken bold actions, like Tuvalu and Vanuatu have spearheaded the call. They were the first 2 nations to step forward to take the leadership. Fiji, Vanuatu, and others are advocating for legal action against major polluters through a new international crime called ecocide. The reality is, if Australia wants to stand with the Pacific, it must follow the lead and commit to phasing out fossil fuels on the fastest possible timeline. And of course, we are committed to a just transition where workers in the fossil fuel industry are taken care of, as well as communities dependent on fossil fuel infrastructure. So the reality is that hosting COP31 comes with responsibilities. Australia is one of the world's biggest fossil fuel producers, and that needs to change. More than half of the global population today resides in cities, with 70% urban areas are already experiencing the effects of climate change, such as external heat. Cities face particular risks and vulnerabilities, next slide please, to the climate crisis, while also exacerbating it by simultaneously consuming 3/4 of the world's energy and generating 2/3 of greenhouse gas emissions. The next slide is a quote from Antonio Guterres, UN Secretary General, speaking to the C40 mayors. He said, cities are where the climate battle will largely be won or lost. Mayors are the world's first responders to the climate emergency. And let's be very clear, failure at the national level or federal level, whatever you call it, the consequences of that will not be primarily felt in pain terms, in responsibility terms, in terms of our citizens at the national level. It is mayors and local governments that will be in the front lines, as we've seen in Lismore, in other parts of the Gold Coast, where we have seen climate disasters already. City diplomacy has stepped up to the forefront of international affairs, and cities are joining the movement to transition away from fossil fuels. They are leading with action from removing the social license of the fossil fuel industry to decarbonizing key sectors like buildings or transport. Next, please. We also have to address one of the reasons why we are seeing setbacks on climate activism, why we are seeing racism rise, and why we're seeing fascism rise, has been that we have not addressed the issue of climate change as a people-centric issue and as a cross-cutting issue, and it was a tactical error to have framed climate change as primarily an environmental issue. And therefore, one of the things we need to do, and as city leaders, you know that you have to embrace the idea of intersectionality, of how different challenges that you are facing, how are they connected to each other. Next slide, please. The other problem is we, in the activist movement, we have talked about climate change too much on a scientific basis, too much on a policy level, and we've aimed all our narratives 1.5 degrees through 50 parts per million and all at the brain, and we ignored the heart, the body, and the soul. And so that is something that we need to do. And the Pacific, yet again, is taking the leadership. For example, there's a popular band called This Is Our Home that is performing on global stages with Coldplay. They perform at the UN General Assembly and so on. And when they sing and bring their artistic talent to the global public square, they move people in the millions, whereas activism and politicians move people in the thousands, right? And so I want to be very clear that we have to, in terms of our messaging at the city level and everywhere else, we need to be able to talk about the climate crisis, about water, about jobs, about housing, about electricity supply, real things that matter to real people. We have not been messaging it correct, and we must have the courage to acknowledge that weakness. So the next, and I'm getting to the end, critical in this moment for us to address also is the problems of eco-anxiety and climate anxiety, and what I would say is a global mental health crisis that we have. We need to mobilize a level of public participation on a scale that has never seen before, given the scale of the challenge that we face. And we need to look at having an approach that has multiple ways in which people participate. Next slide, please. Is that the last one? Okay, so in conclusion, I want to say that we have fundamental problems at many national governing coalitions that we have in place in many countries around the world. It is leaders of cities and other local governments, even in rural areas, who are and will continue to pay the highest price for the lack of courage, vision, and political will to address something that the science has been telling us to do for a long time. So my appeal in conclusion to you is, please, especially given that COP31 is likely to be decided next month, is coming to the Pacific and Australia specifically, we need Australian leadership to come from below. We don't want to put all our eggs in the national. We'll, of course, dialogue with your national government, but we want the voice of local leadership to be strong at the COP, to be strong in our efforts, and endorsing, getting your city or your state to endorse the treaty would be an amazing contribution. Demand that Australia stop approving at the national level new fossil fuels projects before COP31, and challenge fossil fuel narratives that we can't make the transition. We know what to do. We have the human capability, the technological capability. Sadly, all that is missing is political will, and thankfully, political will is a renewable reality, as you know, as elected officials. People can be voted out if they don't do what people want, but we need to make sure that people really want action by being more accessible, more closer to people, speak to the hearts, bodies and soul, not only to the brains. And I think we can turn things around, even though things are heavily stacked against us. I believe that change is possible. I think this year and next year can give us the breakthrough that we need. Thank you very, very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Naidu. That was fantastic. And thank you for that little note of optimism at the end. We're going to have Rob Law speak for a few moments now to give a little bit of Australian context to help us figure out what we do in response to what Dr. Naidu has told us today. I'm going to ask people to hold their questions until Rob has spoken. And if you'd like to put some questions in the chat, we can come back to them. But Rob, I know that you'd like to share your slides as well.
Yes, I'll have a
Are you able to do that? Yeah.
Hopefully. See that one?
Yes, that looks good.
Okay, great. Happy for me to take it away then?
Yes, that's perfect. Great.
Right. Thanks, Sally, and thanks, Kumi, for that great overview of the treaty. So yeah, I'm just going to try and contextualise it a little bit for Australians, and particularly around why I think this is a really critical moment for local governments to sort of help push that subnational pressure towards a fossil fuel phase out. As I was sort of putting the slides together, I know a lot of people in this call know this.
Rob, I just lost your audio. Are you able to unmute there?
I also lost Rob.
Okay, that's back on.
Yep, you're fine. I think you just got muted accidentally.
All right, no problem. So I was just saying, as I was putting these slides together this morning, I was sort of reflecting on the fact that, when I began working on climate change 25 years ago, and even in 2014, when I was doing climate risk assessments for local government, I think there was this sort of idea that it was this sort of abstract problem that was coming down the line. And I think, we're just reviewing the last 6 months in Australia, we've experienced so many of these overlapping climate extremes. And this morning I went out to take my kids to school, and my car was completely covered in dust from a dust storm overnight because of the severe drought that we're in at the moment in regional Victoria. And, meanwhile, there's floods in New South Wales. We had the cyclone earlier in the year, coral bleaching, blah, blah, blah. We all know this story. But I think what we're sort of, I guess, losing in this grand picture is that there's a direct link between climate change and fossil fuels. And so whilst there's sort of growing awareness in the community about climate change, I think we kind of keep needing to re-prosecute this idea that, as Kumi sort of laid out, fossil fuels are, the greatest link towards the impacts that we're seeing on the ground, and communities currently are footing that bill. And so, it is cause for some rage, I think, to think that we're in this situation in 2025 where we do have a situation where only at COP28 fossil fuels were mentioned for the first time in the UN process. Another thing that many of you would have heard over the years, a common story that I've been told by my barber, by my taxi driver, is that Australia is overall insignificant because we have such a small sliver of global emissions from our domestic level emissions. But obviously, as Kumi mentioned, we are the second largest exporter of emissions. And this is something that most people don't know outside of climate nerd circles. And no offense to the Australian kayaking team here, but I think this point that we have an oversized role in global negotiations because we hold this title. And so we really need to do a lot to sort of walk our way out of that situation. And, a big part of that is the incredible fossil fuel subsidies that we're still giving to coal and gas industry in Australia. And, $67 billion was estimated by the Australia Institute in the forward estimates. So just over the next 4 years towards fossil fuels, which is pretty stark distinction, really, when you think about, what the Australian Local Government Association is advocating for a $200 million or $400 million per year adaptation fund. So I think we really need to be pushing harder on this idea of redirecting fossil fuel subsidies. As Kumi mentioned, we're still approving new coal and gas projects, and many of us know this. This little graph here on the side, a colleague of mine whipped up this morning, because there is an imminent decision this week for an expansion of a gas project, Northwest Shelf, you may have heard about. And this is a huge carbon bomb that, will be sort of allowed to emit out to 2070. And so the new Environment Minister will be making a decision on that very soon. And just showing you there in that graph, just that one project, how much it's dwarfing the emissions of all the Pacific Islands' current emissions as well. So it's an incredible situation that we're in. And, one of the big reasons for that, obviously, is that the fossil fuel lobby in Australia is so strong and is one of the biggest political donors in Australia. So the flip side to that is that we have the solutions. We know what we need to do to get out of this situation. There's been a number of different reports now over the last few years. We did one back in 2023 at WWF with the Business Council of Australia and the ACTU, which showed, enormous sort of export opportunities for growing our clean industries to replace fossil fuel exports. And there was a more recent one by the Superpower Institute, which showed that, we have the potential to have 6 to 8 times greater revenue from these green exports than our fossil fuel exports. So that idea that, we can't afford to move away from fossil fuels because it props up our economy is a very moot point nowadays. And I guess in addition to that, we've done a lot of work about how do we make sure that that transition away from fossil fuels is actually one that works for regional communities and it also works to address our biodiversity crisis at the same time. So our latest report, Our Renewable Future, I encourage you to have a look at that because that sort of sets out, a way that we can make this transition work in a just way, but also in a way that's sort of also not going to, I guess, further degrade our natural environment as well. The other problem that we're in at the moment is that we have the situation of value adding to our fossil fuel exports with the growth of green exports. So we really need to be getting that sort of the fossil fuel phase out and calling out the problem of fossil fuels more explicitly. We can't just rely on the fact that we have solutions as we have done in the past few years. Because at the moment, it kind of feels like, we've got the Australian government that's sort of having a healthy salad for its morning tea, but in the meantime, binging on McDonald's for breakfast, lunch and dinner. We really need to be sort of calling out the problem more explicitly and at the same time bringing in the vision of what's possible. Another thing, when you think about taking this back to your councils, I can imagine you'll get a lot of challenges about why this isn't council's core business, and this is something you would have all encountered over the years working on climate change more generally. But obviously, as Kumi sort of laid out with this comment about the intersectionality of the issues that we face from climate change, I think we need to get better at kind of telling the story of how fossil fuels really is undermining everything that council's trying to do. And if you look at any of your council plans, the visions, the goals in those council plans that sort of cascade out to all the other things that council is trying to achieve, all of them are impossible with the continued expansion of fossil fuels. And I think being able to link it to the priorities that other people have in your community at the time is really important. Obviously, with the election, we saw how cost of living was the #1 issue. But when you unpack what that means, you can see the fingerprints of climate change and fossil fuels that are driving up the cost of living pressures, like rising food prices, rising health costs, as well as the sort of exposure to coal and gas and insurance premiums, etc. So just a bit about why now. We do have a very short window of time to try to get some good language into Australia's nationally determined contribution that it's putting forward to the UN in the next few months. And we're sort of pushing, encouraging everyone else to push for fossil fuel phase out as to be a component of that NDC. In the longer term out to sort of next year, obviously Australia has a bid in to host the COP31 in Adelaide. And that's a very strong chance that that will happen, and we might find that out in June, but maybe towards the end of the year otherwise. And the world's attention will be on Australia at that point in time. So between now and then, there will be a lot of opportunities to create that momentum to getting some of this change that we need to see. There's also the treaty timeframe that Kumi mentioned. The more subnational pressure we can get to get more nation states over the line, then the treaty negotiations themselves can start to begin next year. The election result is interesting. We have a supermajority for Labor, which doesn't make fossil fuel phase out easy, but it creates a situation where we have, I guess, a government willing to sort of grow our green export opportunity, our renewable superpower opportunity. So we need to be thinking, how do we link in the fossil fuel phase out more strongly in that work as well? And also, as mentioned at the beginning, this ongoing impacts of climate change that we're seeing more and more. How can we sort of tell that story better and link it back to fossil fuels being the main driver of those impacts? So I guess just to finish with, in terms of what next, what we're hoping for, as we've seen, councils have been involved in the whole litany of these programs and endorsements over the years, and some incredible sort of advocacy has come about globally from local governments coming together at critical points in time. And we've seen that with climate emergency declarations recently, but, right back to the 90s with Cities for Climate Protection as well. And so I think that, there's a real opportunity to sort of get councils motivated to sort of go together and pass motions to endorse the treaty. And as part of that endorsement, I think it's a really good opportunity to also sort of send signals to the federal government, writing letters to Minister Bowen's office or to Catherine King's office for fossil fuel phase out in the NDC, calling out the idea of no new approvals and this idea of redirecting subsidies. If you're asking for financial help to recover from disasters or to build adaptation, then there's a really clear case to be made that those fossil fuel subsidies just can't continue. And as I mentioned before, helping to tell those stories back to your community about why fossil fuel phase out is important to the lives of everyday people is really a good opportunity for councils as well. So I will end it there, and back to you, Sally.
Thanks so much, Rob. Okay, so we're going to throw it open to the floor now. So if you've got questions, please go ahead and put your hand up. Otherwise, pop them in the chat and we'll come to you then. I haven't seen any questions so far apart from technical issues. Don't hold back, folks. And if you're not too shy, feel free to speak up. Just let an awkward silence build.
My chat seems to be turned off, so I can't put anything in the chat.
Okay, feel free to speak up in that case.
Okay, thanks. Look, I suppose I'm very concerned about all of this, and I'd like to do everything I can to activate my council. They do know about this webinar, and they're expecting a recording because I said I'd send it to them. Now, the templates for a motion sound interesting. How can I access those?
Yep, thank you. I just put that in the chat as well. Sorry, I forgot to mention we do have some templates that some councils have provided that have already endorsed back in 2021. So we'll send them around to everyone that's registered afterwards. I think we can do that, Sally.
Yes, we can do that for sure. And I see that Scott has his hand up. Scott.
Thanks, Sally, and thanks, Kumi and Rob, for the great presentations. Question just around timing, given that I thought Australia were meant to submit its NDCs in February, but delayed it because of the election. So how is that sort of overall pathway to commitment looking now? Rob, you mentioned maybe mid-year, but possibly second half of the year. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
They're still obviously waiting on the advice from the Climate Change Authority for the 2035 targets, which is imminent, but probably still, maybe June. So I think that putting that together with the rest of the NDC package is probably, they'll push them pretty close to September, I would imagine. So I think there is still that little window of opportunity to really push this idea of including fossil fuel phase out in that NDC, and that's a global push. Like WWF International is working with countries around the world to try to include fossil fuel phase out in their NDCs as well as other civil society organisations. So it's not just something that would be just Australia, but I think it's a really important point, and we're hoping the Climate Change Authority also puts that in their advice too, as well, beyond just the actual target for emissions reduction.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for that, Rob. I see that Peter has his hand up, and then I'll come to Larry's question in the chat. Peter.
Oh, hello. I'm sorry, I can't turn my camera on.
We can see you all good.
Oh, okay, great. Yes, I'm in the Beyond Gas network, and our focus is on fossil fuel exports essentially. But I was talking to a friend who was talking to a minister, actually the former Attorney General, and he asked him about fossil fuel exports and fossil fuel emissions, and he said they're not our emissions. They're not our emissions. So it was and that seems to me to be consistent with the Paris Agreement, and I'm wondering how. And these NDC seems to be about domestic emissions, not about fossil fuel emissions. So I know you just said that some countries are putting in fossil fuel emissions in the NDC. I just want more clarification on that, please. So I don't think it's quite clear that. I think if we went to our local member and we said, what are you going to do about fossil fuel exports in the NDC? He'll say it's not our problem.
Yep, no, good point. So the clarity there is that the NDC has our domestic emissions reduction target for 2035 as part of it, but it's a much broader package, which can include adaptation finance as well, and fossil fuel phase out for its exports as well. So it can include all of those things. And, you know, that person is right in the sense of a carbon accounting exercise. We don't count our export emissions until they're burnt by some other country. But I think it's a fairly, you know, handy excuse that's been used for many decades now by the Australian government. But yes, the NDCs can include fossil fuel phase out for exports. But I'll throw to Kumi. I think you might have some more to say.
Yeah, no, thank you, Peter, for that. And just to build on Rob's response, see, the issue is that we know that climate change and carbon emissions doesn't respect national boundaries, right? So, you know, so the fact that Australia behaves well within its own borders, but then sends that same poison to other countries is going to blow back on Australia and exacerbate the problem for the rest of the world. So it is really short-sighted thinking on the part of the Australian government to make that argument. And I can say, and I'm hopeful that we are making good progress in Europe right now to get European governments on board. And most probably one or two of the European countries will next year, by no later than October, host the global conference on fossil fuels, the first ever. Just as the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty started with a global conference on nuclear weapons, and the negotiation started after that. So, and by the way, we can start the negotiations once we get to 25 countries, right? We're not waiting for everybody to join. And some of you who are as old as me might remember an American movie called Field of Dreams with Kevin Costner in it. I don't know whether people remember the tagline, which was, "If you build it, they will come," right? And so once the negotiations start, no question that countries will gravitate towards it. Right now, we want the kinds of countries that are there to be there, right? Which are countries that accept the climate science, not giving us a lot of, you know, bullshit around one day saying we agree the science and the next day passing policies that go against the science and so on. And so, so we want high ambition, first moving countries. But importantly, I just want to highlight 3 countries. So most of them are from the Pacific. We got 3 Caribbean island states. But I want to highlight 2 countries, Colombia in Latin America and Timor-Leste in your part of the world. These are 2 fossil fuel exporting countries whose economies are heavily dependent on fossil fuel revenue. They have joined because they said, listen, we know currently our economy is, you know, needing this investment, this revenue flow, but we know that it's just being stupid in terms of our short, medium, and long-term interests as a nation. And so the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty has started a whole initiative to set up a just transition investment fund. In September last year, we met at the UN General Assembly with 40 investment houses. We're moving forward with actually supporting the Colombian, Timor-Leste, and other governments to figure out, like say in Colombia's case, they've got $44 billion in what they call shovel-ready investments. They're looking for private investment where they will transition to sustainable tourism, sustainable agriculture, of course, renewables, battery and storage, and they're looking at various other revenue streams. And we cannot tell countries, right, shut down fossil fuels if we cannot help them to find pathways to replace the revenue from, you know, what they were getting from fossil fuels, but also making sure that not only workers in the industry are taken care of, but communities, like say in Newcastle now, there's a whole range of secondary industries that are dependent on the fossil fuel infrastructure that is there, right? So, so I don't think I think it's ingenuous of Australian political leadership to actually say, oh, we can meet our NDCs, even though we are actually contributing to hiking up the NDCs of other signatories to the Paris Accord as if that was good enough. I think that's a little bit disingenuous and short-sighted of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Kumi. We've got some great questions in the chat, and I think actually I might throw back to you, Kumi, for this one. Larry asks, is it a good thing or a bad thing that Australia is seeking to host the COP next year? Any thoughts about that?
That's a great question. I'm not sure, to be honest, but let's say right now, what's called the intersessional meetings, these are the meetings that happen at Bonn, where the UNFCCC is, headquartered, will start in about 2 weeks' time, right? And one of the decisions they're going to make is whether Australia will get it. So the gossip is that it's really the only two countries that put up their hands was Australia and Turkey. And Turkey has taken a position like, let's see what happens with the the Canadian elections. Let's see if they put it in and so on. But right now, if you were a betting person, you can bet that it's coming to Australia, right? Given how the elections went. But given that's a reality, right, or is a high probable reality, I think it's incumbent on local governments, on civil society, on faith leaders, progressive elements within national government and so on, to really try to do something that Australia and New Zealand need to do as good neighbors to the most vulnerable countries in the world, right, which are Pacific Island states, who, like Kiribati, for example, who are almost certainly could be, in a decade and a half or so, could be looking at the real prospect of large amounts of the islands, those atoll islands particularly, who are not going to be able to, So I think that the Pacific as a whole, and Australia as the largest dominant part of any Pacific Island state, I think could use this opportunity to actually show the vulnerability. Nations here could disappear in our lifetime, right? And we need to get off our butts and stop talking but acting. So in that sense, if the decision happens, I would say, let's make it work for our children and their children's future. But to be honest with you, I'm not sure whether it's because when you ask the question, who is it good for who? It might be good for certain parts of Australia, certain parts of the Pacific. It's a difficult question to answer in absolute terms. But given all the choices, I think Australia, in partnership with the Pacific, is probably one of the best options for COP convening. And as you know, we had two disastrous venues last time round, where we had fossil fuel petro states, leading the negotiations with the chairperson of the fossil fuel company in that country, Azerbaijan, being the president of the COP and so on. I would hope that the Australian government will not behave in such a manner, and that they will create real space for Pacific leadership in the COP as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Kumi. We can hope. Yes, Rob, please weigh in.
I might add to that and answer Belinda's question too about how do you stop fossil fuel companies using COP as a promotional tool, because as Kumi mentioned, even at the Australian Pavilion, people probably remember in 2021, Santos sponsored the Australian Pavilion with their Moomba CCS projects, which has turned out to be an abject failure. So I think there is that real risk, and we've seen that even with the Nature Positive Summit last year, where there was a very nice sort of chance for the Australian government to sort of make a case that it's doing really well on certain aspects of nature protection. But I think there is that real risk that it could be a greenwashing exercise for the government. But as Kumi mentioned, we're sort of pushing this idea of a people's COP. So really creating the situation where it's inclusive with the Pacific, and they're a really strong partner, but also with civil society organisations more broadly, so that we can sort of help kind of push, broader narratives. And it will be in South Australia, so it will be, a chance for them to talk up, South Australia's amazing renewable energy journey, but at the same time, that's the home of Santos too, and so there will be that sort of chance to kind of put a lot of pressure in on the fossil fuel phase out. The other thing, no, I think that's about it. That's all I'll say to that. But I think to Belinda's point, I think comms declare, that's a good strategy.
Thanks, Rob. And we're nearly at the end of our time, but we have a couple more questions. I see you've answered one there, Rob. Thanks for that. A question from Murray is, are nearly all of the Pacific Island countries supporters of the treaty? And for any that aren't, are they intending to sign up?
Yes, almost all of them are. We have Papua New Guinea and about 3 others, but we hope that by the time of the COP in Brazil, they all would sign. Like, say, for example, Kiribati, which was the leading Pacific Island state in terms of climate activism. The only reason they've not signed is there's some really serious internal political conflict, nothing to do with the Fossil Fuel Treaty and so on. And because President Anate Tong, the previous president, was such a climate champion, there's all sorts of kind of politics going on. But we are cautiously confident that the few remaining Pacific Island states will sign, if not before COP30, then at COP30. That's what we're working towards.
Kumi, could I just ask a question for you? Because I think you might have mentioned it today, but I didn't catch it. Is there a threshold of countries that you need when you start negotiating the treaty?
So, based on the international convention, because we're negotiating it outside of starting the negotiations outside of the treaty, we can start even with 16 countries. But we've set ourselves a couple of kind of targets, right? One is we need to have every region having a representative country involved. So we've got 6 nations in the conversation in Africa, but we haven't had a formal endorsement yet, and we hope to get that. We've got about 6 countries in Europe. Like, for example, I was just in Iceland, met with the president and the foreign minister in Iceland, and they are, well, it's a very easy country to phase out fossil fuels. They only have emissions from sailing and aviation. So I think we had set about 25 countries or more, but we must have regional representation. And sorry, the other thing I should say is that we have one large population country on board, and that is Pakistan, which also brings in a South Asian sort of regional perspective. So there's to be honest, it's less important that we go to like 45 countries. If we get to 25, 30 countries, but we have, or there's 1 or 2 countries per region that start the negotiations, we're good with that. And I've also met with the Climate Vulnerable Forum, whose Secretary General is the former president of Maldives, Mohammed Nasheed, in Ghana, where the headquarters of the Climate Vulnerable Forum is. And, we're looking at trying to see whether we can get a block of countries like that to come on board. And at some point, if we get that breakthrough, or if we get a breakthrough, the LDC country group, then we could have an explosion of numbers, but we're not there yet. Thanks.
Thanks, Kumi. So we're just about at the end of the time. So I want to let you know that we will distribute all of the information that's been shared in an email afterwards. Kumi, is it okay if we share your presentation as well?
Yes,
fantastic.
Please do.
Great, we'll do that. And we'll also share Rob's, if that's okay. Yep, fantastic. And we'll share all the links that have been put in the chat. And I'd like to, of course, give a really big thank you to Dr. Kumi Naidoo and to Rob Law for speaking with us today. It's been really great to hear directly from you. I hope that's really made a difference for a lot of the councils to really understand what the treaty is all about, where it's coming from, and what we can do to support you. Please do get in touch if there's anything that anybody wants to follow up on. But yeah, I'll just check whether Rob or Kumi have any last words they'd like to share before we say goodbye.
Thank you, Sally, for your wonderful moderation. My only criticism of your moderation is that you periodically call me Dr. Naidu. Please, Kumi works just fine. And then what I was wanting to just say is that think about whether you have time right now. There's about 6 months to go. Whether you can get some foundations in Australia to fund a sizable delegation of Australian local governments to come to COP30 in Brazil. So that maybe these things are happening already and I don't know about it, but I think that once a decision gets made that COP31 is coming to Australia next month, assuming it gets made, you will be in a very strong position if you'll work collectively and say, listen, we are going to effectively be hosting with the federal government the COP. We want to go see how it happens. We want to bring our expertise. We want to bring our voice. I think that'll be a great thing to do. Thank you. And we, as the treaty, will be very happy to support you in any way and open up doors to engage with other local governments and so on. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming today. And thank you, Sally and Rob, for organizing it.
Fantastic. Great message, Kumi. Rob, anything you want to finish on?
No, that's great. Hopefully by the end of the year, we'll have 50 councils endorsing is my goal. So look forward to it.
Amazing. All right, get signing up, folks. And thank you again to Kumi and Rob. And thanks everyone for being here today.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sally.